My name is Dale Gotro, and I'm the director of the Institute for Leadership Advancement, and we have the privilege of putting on these events for the Terry College of Business and the campus. Let me introduce, first of all, this morning, our hostess for the day and introduce her. Allie Heinsohn is a senior accounting major from Columbia, South Carolina. She's a member of the Leonard Leadership Scholars class of 2012. She's the Vice President of Finance for Kappa Alpha Theta. And did I mention she's looking for a job? She'll introduce our speaker here this morning.
Thanks, Dr. G. It's my privilege today to introduce to you a legendary leader, Shirley Franklin. I want to take a minute of your time to tell you about her accomplishments. Ms. Franklin was elected Atlanta's 58th mayor in 2001 and subsequently served the city from 2002 to 2010. She was the first African-American woman to serve as the mayor of any major southern city. As mayor, Ms. Franklin made a real difference. She tackled ethics reform, launched the Atlanta Beltline, completed over $5 billion in airport and water infrastructure improvement, and raised $32 million to acquire the Morehouse College collection of Martin Luther King Jr. papers. And Time magazine named her one of the U.S.'s 5 best big city mayors. Before becoming mayor of Atlanta, Ms. Franklin earned her Bachelor of Arts in Sociology from Howard University and Master's degree in Sociology from the University of Pennsylvania. Ms. Franklin was recently named to Delta Airlines Board of Directors. But being a legend is obviously just not enough for Ms. Franklin. You see, she recently was named CEO and Chairman of Purpose-Built Communities, an organization whose mission is to transform struggling urban neighborhoods across the United States in cities like New Orleans and Indianapolis. She's transforming these cities with the business backing and financial support of business leaders like Warren Buffett, Julian Robertson, and our very own Terry alum, Tom Cousins. Ms. Franklin, as you can see, is full of spirit, energy, and enthusiasm for our future. Will you please join me now in welcoming Ms. Franklin?
Thank you very much for that introduction. Am I on? Yes. I can hear myself. It's good to be with you. I have been on the university campus before, but not to the Terry College, so I thank you, the dean, and to the others for inviting me to this series. I am recently back from an international trip, so I think I have all my faculty with me. As recently as yesterday. But I am thrilled to be here to give you a little bit of background about my experiences in public leadership and to talk to you about purpose-built. So let me start with the background on how I came to this place. I went to college in 1963, and I was asked earlier how I got involved in politics, and I explained that if you were living and breathing and thinking, you were involved in politics at some level or another in the 1960s. The country was full of debate about political issues, about social issues, about women's issues, about issues of civil rights. So my interest started very early in high school. And I was an observer and was involved in some political marches on the Pentagon at 15 and 16 years old. There was a whole student movement from high school all the way through college on political issues, and I shared with the dean some of the demonstrations that used to take place so that, about how young people would be involved. John F. Kennedy ran for president, and that sparked the interest of a lot of young people, because up until that time they really were mostly older men running for office, and here was this young man with a certain vibrancy about him, and lots of us got interested. I didn't do anything about it other than just be interested, but it piqued my interest. I was 15 or 16 years old. And then I went to Howard University in January of 1963. And that summer there was a march on Washington called the March on Washington with Dr. King. And literally hundreds of thousands of people came. And those who brought me to this building today already know that I had intended to go with my boyfriend, but my mother insisted that I go with her. And if you know history, you'll know the only reason I heard Dr. King is because I went with my mother. Dr. King was the last speaker, no one wanted to speak after him. And I happened to still be there because my mother was going to see that as a 17-year-old. I was there for the whole event. So early in my life, I became very interested in social issues. And my interest in politics was specifically related to my interest in social change and how to improve the lot and condition of many people who lived in America without rights, without civil rights, without economic rights, and without a voice. And as an African-American woman, you look at me and say I must have been talking primarily about African Americans, but the answer to that question is no. Women very much were in secondary roles in the 1960s and faced many hurdles. And the women's movement, the student movement, which includes all of you, plus the civil rights movement were closely paralleled in terms of the movements of that era. And our interest, so my interest in politics was directly related to my interest in the agendas of the student movement, the African American movement, and the women's movement, and changing the lives and opportunities of people like me, but also like you. So I moved to Atlanta. I taught at a small school in Alabama. And I'm a big city girl from Philadelphia, so I drive to Atlanta every weekend or every other weekend. And fell in love with Atlanta and moved here in 1972. Maynard Jackson was running for mayor as the first elected African-American mayor of a major southern city. Andrew Young ran for Congress as the first black congressman since Reconstruction in the 1890s. I was involved in both of those campaigns. What distinguished me at that time was not that I had great ideas about policy. What distinguished me at the time was I was one of the few people who didn't mind doing fundraising, asking people for money. And so, in fact, some of my early assignments I had to do with working on the fundraising and the financial side. I don't have a finance background, but I can count. I'm basic enough that I can put all the dimes and nickels and dollars together. So a lot of my association with politics started with fundraising, asking people to support the candidates with more than their vote. I'm sure you're glad to hear that. More than their vote, but also to talk to them about fundraising. So that has attracted me over the years to not just the political side of it, but the organizational side. And fast forward, after leaving office in January of 2010, I went to Spelman College for 18 months and shortly thereafter joined Purpose-Built Community. So I'm a sociology major with a minor in anthropology and African studies. I started working in Eastlake, which was the most crime-ridden, most depressed neighborhood and community in Atlanta, and one of the worst in the country at the time we started. The crime rate was 18 times the national average. The unemployment level was almost 90% for the adults. The student achievement was about 5% on state exams when we started. Don Edwards and I'm so glad that you're here with us today. We were asked, well, how many people were involved? I said about 5 or 6, and we're 2 of them. And if you count Mr. Cousins' family, maybe get to 15. But at the time, people thought that it is impossible to transform a community in our lifetime where the people who live in that community are able to reclaim their lives, sustain successful lives. Tom Cousins, Don Edwards, Hugh Chapman, several other business people went about this activity. Why? Tom Cousins tells the story that he read the New York Times in early 1990s, read a New York Times magazine story, and in reading that story, learned from the police officers who were quoted that there were 5 or 6, maybe 7 neighborhoods in New York that represented some 70% of the prisoners at Rikers Island in the prisons. So he calls New York. He calls the police department, finds out that's true. He calls the Atlanta police. They say that's true in Atlanta too, and the worst is Eastlake. The worst is Eastlake. So he decides, after many years of philanthropy, many years of contributions to the community, that he's going to go out to Eastlake and see what's going on there. And in fact, came at a time when President Carter, former President Carter, had already started conversations at Eastlake. President Carter, after leaving office, decided that he wanted to be involved because Eastlake was known as one of the worst places. Tom Cousins tells the story of telling President Carter that he, in fact, is going to work at Eastlake, and President Carter tells him that Mrs. Eva Davis, who was the head of the Resident Association, was the hardest person to negotiate that he had ever met in his life. And you know, he did a lot in the Middle East. Said she was very, very hard and tough, and it was impossible. Anyway, Tom gathers a few people, Don, Hugh Chapman, a few people, and says, we are going to do a master plan, and we're going to engage the community. I wasn't involved from day one. They had been at this for about 2 years, and I got a call after the Olympics in 1996, and I was called to ask if I would help be the interface with the community and government. By this time, they had formed a partnership with the Atlanta Housing Authority, who was in the process of developing a new model for public housing. And that new model would be mixed income housing. Some people say it's still controversial. If you've ever visited a place, you know it is a much better answer. So Eastlake's new housing doubled the number of people who live in the villages of Eastlake. But by doubling it, added mixed income housing to the model, market rate housing. So now some 2,000 people live in this community. The crime rate is half of the city's average. Instead of being 18 times the national average, it's half of the city's average. And some people say safer than some of the neighborhoods that you would name as upper income. 75% of the people work versus nobody before, 10%. Student achievement is phenomenal. 80% of the students in Drew Charter School, which is the school that is a part of this model, 80% of the students, 80% of the students now achieve at or above, exceed the state average in every subject from 1st grade to 8th grade. 80% are free and reduced lunch. 90+% achieve at or above the state average. And in some subjects, 50% exceed the state average. From 1st grade in every subject. Most people who hear this story say, well, you just brought in a lot of middle-class kids. Wrong. 80% free and reduced lunch, which means they are in the lowest areas. These are students who are now going to college. These are students who now are competing and contributing. And these students are in one of the best schools in the state. When we started, the school was ranked 69th of 69 elementary schools in Atlanta. Last year it was ranked 7th. And the only schools that were ranked at a higher level were those who had less than 10% of students with free and reduced lunch. So the model has completely shifted. It is one of several projects all over America that is completely turning on, upending the model that poor people can achieve. Poor people, when you have a concentration of poor people. We believe that it's a three-pronged approach. It's mixed income housing, and we don't mean mixed low-income housing. We mean mixed income housing with market rate housing. So a three-bedroom apartment in East Lake Villages will cost what a three-bedroom apartment would cost anyplace else. It's an excellent school. In our case, it's pre-K. The school starts at 3 years old. The children go to school at 3 and 4 years old. I don't mean a preschool. I mean they are in a classroom, they're in uniforms, they have 2 master's degree teachers. And one of the great stories about the young people is the second year of the operation at the lower level, the 4-year-olds outscored the 5-year-olds on academic performance. Why 3 years old? All the research says that a child from an upper middle income family has been exposed to 30 million words by the time they're 3 or 4 years old. And we found that lower income children were not being exposed. So there is a very intentional process of introducing language very early. So an excellent school. The third piece is support services, new grocery store, new bank branch. You say, what difference does that make? Well, if you're a low-income person and you have to pay or spend all this time to go to preschool or after school or the grocery store, you have just eaten up half the time that you would spend with your family or working. So a new grocery store, a new public store, a YMCA, a preschool, a golf course, a whole array of activities that support young people, a longer school day, a longer school year. So the model is very robust. Indianapolis is in the midst of duplicating this. The city of Indianapolis has an area called Avondale Meadows, and the city and the private developers and not-for-profits are investing. Similar project in New Orleans. There was a wonderful photograph of President Obama walking in front of a public housing project about a year ago on the cover of the front page of the New York Times. That was our project. He was there to visit this tremendous, and it's the Bayou District there. Our goal, and we have 3 very generous supporters, Tom Cousins, Warren Buffett, and Julian Robertson. Julian Robertson and Warren Buffett are known in financial circles. Perhaps Warren Buffett better, but Julian Robertson is a tremendously successful hedge fund creator and manager. And he is now purely a philanthropist. He introduced himself last week at our conference as an environmental Republican. He said, I know that's an oxymoron, but he said that's what I am. But he's very interested in climate change, environmental issues, and has invested in this. Now, what do? We have a small staff of 7. I am among them, and we go out around America and introduce ourselves and encourage people to adopt this model. And then we are the free Boston Consulting Group, the free McKinsey. We charge you nothing for the service. We are in the business of trying to duplicate the model in 25 cities in the next 4.5 years. Because we believe if we can do that, we can change national policy. We can become the norm as opposed to just the exception. So we are working in 7 other cities. Galveston had huge storms, they've got lots of money. Instead of just replacing public housing, we are saying to them, you can build a new community. And community requires more than new housing. I have lived in Atlanta long enough to see public housing rebuilt twice on the same site. Federal money, all our tax dollars, go in and be rebuilt because a sense of community. Our project requires work. If you live in the project, it's in your lease that you have to either be in school, disabled, or working. It is grounds to be removed. Now, some people say that's too harsh. But would you like to hear who, I want you to guess, who required that? Do you think Purpose Built did that? East Lake Foundation? The residents, the people who were living in public housing who wanted a better place, said, we want you to enforce the work requirement. The children wear uniforms. I was the first chair of the charter school board. My children went to Paideia. I mean, you know, you probably don't know that school. But it's an alternative school. I mean, it was hard to get them to put clothes on. They just dressed anyway. But the residents said we want our children to wear uniforms because it's less expensive for a poor person. The children are not competing over what they're wearing or not wearing, whichever the case may be. So these are and the model is based on housing, mixed income housing, excellent schools, support services. And the final piece that makes this different is that we believe you have to have a not-for-profit. And that's where Don and I met, because we were on the East Lake Foundation. And the foundation's responsibility is to integrate all of those activities in the community and to attract investment from around the broader community. So East Lake cost about $110 million. The new villages of East Lake, the school, the golf course, the public golf course. But it has brought in $200 million in private investment. So it is leveraged 2 to 1. Public money leveraged 2 to 1 private money in terms of investment. And hence you see a community now that is built around what was an eyesore and a real drain on the community. What you now see is a community that contributes to the tax base. And that everyone in the community has a place to play, a place and a role to play. So it's a very exciting project. When I describe this in Omaha or some other place, people say, well, you must have moved all the poor people out. Wrong. There are more people served today than there were when we started, who would qualify in the socioeconomic level of poor. Secondly, they'd say, well, you moved all the black people out. Wrong. The school is 98% African American. So this breaks the model on several levels. I am thrilled to do this work. I told Tom when he asked me to join Purpose Built that this is the kind of work I would do for free if I could afford to. I mean, that's how committed I am. It's where I started. It is the reason I went into public life. It's the reason I care about politics. I do care about foreign affairs because I want our country to be safe and prosperous, but I mostly care about country and our ability to be successful over the long term. So if I have to choose, I'm going to choose U.S. It's just, I'm global in my approach, but I want this country to be strong. I think that's my obligation. I think it's my obligation to leave my part of the world, whatever part I'm operating in, better than I found it. And I think the people who came before me had felt the same obligation. Hence, I was given opportunities that were unlikely when I was born in 1945. It was not likely that I, as an African American woman, would have had the opportunities that I have had in America. So my job is to be sure that 60 years from now, people look back at the place that I live and work and see that my generation set the foundation for future generations, people I will never know. So I am really excited to be here. This is a strange time in American business because of the death of Steve Jobs. I mean, it's an amazing set of contributions that he gave. I think he was motivated by all the right reasons. He was motivated intellectually, he was motivated socially, and he understood the connection of his work to the rest of the world. And I believe that his legacy is one of improving the world. And it is a good time for us to reflect on what we are going to do as individuals. Clearly, he did not build Apple by himself, but he was a big part of leading it to new heights and just technology, the use of technology. So I'm delighted to be here. I used to be that I didn't introduce a new representative from this district. We want to be sure Representative Williams is, you need to stand up, be recognized, come and vote. In public life. It looks a lot easier than it is. And that's true of everything in life, isn't it? So you have questions for me, comments? I can talk about a lot of other things, but I wanted to tell you about Homelessness. Yes?
My name is Marcus Cole, and my question is, the project that you mentioned has a lot of wonderful advantages, but what are some of the pushbacks that you get, and what are some of the legitimate issues that are brought up about taking this model around the nation?
Oh, I get criticized for pretty much anything I do. So there's a big article in an alternative newspaper last week that I was trying to privatize public education because it's a charter school. For the record, in Georgia, charter schools are public schools. Our charter is a neighborhood charter, which means anyone who lives in the neighborhood has a right to go to the school. So that's, but the pushback is, well, charters are not good. There are some cities, Detroit being one, more recently Philadelphia, there are charter schools and different charter laws all over the state, all over the United States. They are usually state laws. But in Georgia, they're all public schools. So one of the pushbacks is that if you don't fix the whole system, you haven't fixed anything. So if you fix one school at a time, that's not sufficient. There's another model, however, that's like saying that, well, in business, the iPad didn't fix everything, but everyone started copying. People said, oh, nobody's going to want the iPad. Remember? At least that's what I've read about. So all of a sudden, so there is this model that if you can change one thing for the better, that it will have a positive effect on others. So I think, that's kind of the other side. So it's one school at a time. Right now, the Drew Charter School has 900 students. The school system has over 40,000 students. So 900 of those 40,000 are in this particular charter. We think that we've become a laboratory for how do you succeed. But there is also an argument, so there's an argument against the housing. If there's still more poor people, how come you don't build 100% of affordable housing? And some nonprofits do that, some very successful nonprofits. None of them have been able to change the community culturally unless they have introduced market rate housing. We're the only ones who do that intentionally. At Eastlake, there are no units that are public housing and some units that are private housing, market rate housing. They're all integrated. If you walk into the unit, they all look the same. It's only a difference in what you pay and how you get qualified to come in. So there are people who say if you can spend $100 million, you are better off spending it to help 100% of poor people. I personally don't think that's sustainable over time. The way to attract investment, private investment, is to have, the community has to have some discretionary income. So the grocery store does not come unless it's completely subsidized by the government, which I don't think we'll see in the United States. You have a much harder time bringing the service when you have a population that is all very low income. I didn't tell you the difference in the income. When we started the income level, and these are 95% African American women headed households. The income level was under $5,000. Today it's almost 16. So that's 15 years later. And when you add the services that they get, like the after-school programs, the tutorial programs, the summer programs, the after-tax value of those programs, I believe is somewhere between $5,000 and $7,000. So by national standards, that would put them right tipping at the poverty level, moving into sustainable income levels. But so I mean, those are some of the pushbacks. And historically, and there's a lot of debate in Congress about this. There's a lot of debate in the House about this. There's a lot of debate around the country in legislatures about whether any public money should go into such projects. Yes?
My name is Michael. I was wondering, how do you get the funding? Are you essentially going from city to city lobbying with local
Oh yeah, that's a good
federal
question.
government? But yeah, where does
No,
the funds come from?
that's a great question. The reason for the not-for-profit, we try to form what we call a lead organization. It often is philanthropists and business people from a community who say they have been contributing to their community for years and years and haven't seen sustainable good results on the scale that they're interested in. So they might put some of these philanthropists put $20 million into public education, but they don't see a real change in the lowest income. So they see this model and say, or they see Harlem Children's Zone and say, well, wait a minute, there's got to be another model. So many times it's the philanthropists that come, family foundations, business people who said, you know, we've been doing this for generations the same way. And they go hunting, looking, researching who's done a different model. So some of our leads come that way. Some of them come from the not-for-profit sector. The city of Tampa has a very active boys and girls, YMCA. And the YMCA has adopted the lowest performing school in the poorest neighborhood. They have now heard about our project. They do after school and summer programs. See, our model is you do it all day in the normal school day. And the after school is fine, but you really want to change the core functions of activity. So sometimes the Y, in this case the CEO of the Y, who used to be in the city of Decatur, Georgia, hears about what we're doing and says, I want to know more. In some cases, it's the housing authority. Newark has, you've probably heard nothing but negative things about Newark, but Newark has one of the highest functioning and most effective housing authorities. They are the development authority as well as the housing authority for the city of Newark. So when you watch the events in the Coliseum, it was the housing authority in Newark that actually did the financing for that. So it's an interesting model, but they've got great housing, but they haven't been able to break the cycle of poverty because they have no relationship with the schools. I mean, they know the people who are in the schools, and they don't understand that you've got to have these wraparound services. So in that case, it's the city housing authority that comes to us. The funding is layered. Often it's some federal funding for the housing component. It's a lot of private money and public money for the schools. If they're charter schools, you get public funding. There's an allocation from the state, set by the state of Georgia, in Georgia, and you get a certain amount. There's some private fundraising for the schools. And then for the private business investment, publics funded their own property. But the lead organization, which is Eastlake in our case, they actually bought the land. Remember when we did that, Donna? We bought the land and held it because we couldn't get any grocery store to invest. They didn't believe it either. There were 5 of us plus another 10, and eventually it grew. And the truth of the matter is, it took the Publix or Kroger's, in our case Publix, about 5 years to believe that we were going to have a mixed income community that could support, a full grocery store. So it's layered. There's no one single source. The first model was very expensive, and we don't think it needs to be that expensive. In Indianapolis, the city used, you don't care about all the sources in the federal government, but there are dozens of different federal grants that cities can get or do get by formula, and they directed some of the funding for the infrastructure, for the housing rehab, etc. So there's a fairly complicated financing model that will differ from community to community, but it will always be private funding for schools, and some federal funding or local funding, development authority or housing authority funding for the housing. At Drew Charter School, the education that I described costs $1,500 more per student a year. So we get these results with $1,500 per student. That's not much. It's the way the funds are allocated. We have a STEAM school, not a STEM school. So it's science, technology, engineering, arts, and math. Every child in the school learns to play golf. Every child in the school takes tennis lessons. Every child in the school has swimming. We built all those facilities. The Eastlake Foundation built all those facilities. But every child takes violin. And every child has language, a second language. So we built this model that's slightly different. But thank you for that question. Really important part of it. It's not easy to do, but it is possible. Yes?
My name is Aaron Coleman. I'm a local school teacher and leader in the schools, Cedar Shores High School. My question to you is, you mentioned being in control of the schools and that type of thing. Is your suggestion generally to convert to a charter model and then have some sort of governing body that you have a cooperation with, or do you work with the local district as it is? I mean, what's your vehicle for change?
Our vehicle is charter.
Okay.
Our primary vehicle is charter, but in Nebraska, where we're working, there are no charters. So obviously, we're looking for other, models as well. The first one, and this is a funny story, or maybe it was funny to me. Greg Gianelli and I, Greg is the president, and we've worked in various capacities with each other, both inside, and he was the COO of the city in my last 3 years, but he also was the executive director of the Eastlake Foundation. So I've been his boss, he's been my boss. We just get along very well. He and my job was to help him when I was in the private sector before I ran for office. My job was to help him get a relationship with the Atlanta School Board. That was one of my assignments. Well, we worked on that for over a year. And we got 2.5 votes. We asked for, that's how successful I was, right? And the state's charter law changed, and we walked out of one of the most, it wasn't a contentious meeting, but it was the same old meeting. You're not changing the whole system, and we looked at each other and we said charter. That's how we did charter. Let me tell you what the holdup was. The Eastlake Foundation was going to raise all of the money privately to build a brand new school where a dilapidated school existed. We asked if we, as the Eastlake Foundation, could have one of 5 people making the decision on who the principal was. And the school board's 2.5 members said yes. So, at some point, our theory was great teachers and great principals make great schools. And we wanted to know, how do you ensure that and sustain it over time? And we thought that if we were actually a party to helping to recruit a great principal, we had a better chance of having great teachers. And we were turned down. So the model we use is charter. We recognize that we might have to change that model in some states which don't have charters. There is some conversation now about expanding the school from, and the only reason I'll tell you why it was from kindergarten, pre-K to 8th grade, because he and I decided it was too hard to get the first charter for K to 8, K to 5. So we might as well get K to 8 when we started. We didn't start the school in K to 8, we started in K to 5. And the 5th graders went to the 6th, and the 6th grade, they went up. But it was purely just, what's the shortest distance between two points? We got scared that we would not be able to get it later on, so we might as well just get K to 8 while we were at it. Here's where we made the mistake. We should have got K to 12. So even when you think you're looking out and being bold, seeing K to 8 seemed amazing. We're like, oh, that's pretty cool. 10 years into it, we really need K to 12. And the moral of that story is when you're thinking bold, push yourself further. Don't be satisfied. I mean, no, oh, that's a really bold move. No, not really. Push yourself. Yes. Now this is all men. That's not going to work for me. Okay? I'll ask all the men's questions, and you all men can ask, but some women have got to ask some questions. Yes.
Thank you for being here with us. But I guess you've taken kind of a private sector view to an area that historically has been, governed by the government, or looked over by the government. Do you think that kind of view, and you've obviously transformed this area, do you think that view could be taken in other parts of our government system?
Well, some cities do a better job than that than others. I mean, the city of Indianapolis, a long time ago, took a competitive bid on basic city services. Stephen Goldsmith, who was the mayor at the time, was he put city services out for bid, and sometimes the private sector would win, and sometimes the public sector would win for basic city services. I mean, how many of you have been to the Atlanta airport? Pretty much a lot of people, right? That airport has less than 1,000 city employees, but 55,000 people work there. So it is what appears to be a public sector operation is in fact a private sector operation with public sector engagement. So the financing of the airport is very much a public and private sector. It's airlines, it's concessionaires, it's parking. Every time you park and pay money, you're helping to pay the bonds off at the airport. And there's no money from the city of Atlanta going into it. We own the land, we own the property, we own the gates. But it is very much a private public sector initiative. You don't think about that because there's no reason for you to know those details. So there are obviously examples of where you can do these public sector. It's primarily private sector operation with public sector engagement. We own the land, we have the bonding authority. Our bonding authority gets us lower rates because we can get rates as a not-for-profit or a governmental entity. And we have a lot to say about it, but it's by no means a completely public sector. Most people would not think of that. 1,000 employees that are public sector employees and 50+ thousand private sector people make that airport work. So that is to your point. That the question really, and that's an unusual model, by the way. Atlanta has an unusual airport model. But the truth of the matter is, I mean, in order to move into this next iteration of our economy, we're going to have to look at these different models. So cities have done it, private sector have done it. We tried to privatize our water system. The city tried to privatize the water system before I got there. We had a huge, very successful water company and companies bidding. Won, but it was really a terrible contract for both the city and the water company. Largely because the city operation really had not analyzed all the elements of their operation. And when the new person came in, the water company came in, They actually assumed some things about the city and vice versa. So it's one of the strangest things that happened while I was in office. So the contract said that if the city canceled the contract in 20 years, that the city would pay the water company, the private company, publicly traded company. We would pay them $5 million if we canceled. By the time Greg and I did that together, Greg and the finance team and all of our team looked at it, the company paid us $6 million to leave. Because it wasn't a good, it wasn't a good fit. Just because you try it and it looks good on paper doesn't mean it operates. What's hard to do in the public sector is to get in and out of these deals. I mean, typically what happens in the public sector, whether it's public schools or public transport or anything, I mean, there's this assumption that because it's in the public sector and it's our dollars, your dollars and mine, that they should get it right the first time. That's not the way it works in the private sector. People try things, and then they come out of it. I mean, you're probably too young to remember when New Coke came out. There's this huge announcement about New Coke. Weeks later, that didn't work. Coke Classic came back. And nobody, or maybe business majors did, but nobody in the public was complaining about, oh, they made this big mistake and they spent $100 million doing market research, et cetera, et cetera. We all thought they were brilliant for changing. That's a classic Coke. Oh boy, they're really smart because they said, no, not today. But in the public sector, there's this sense that if you do it, I mean, the most common question I get from reporters were, do you know that the city made such and such a mistake? I'm like, what time is it? And they'd say, well, what do you mean? I said, the sun came up today. We're bound to make mistakes. You know, right? Now, we shouldn't make big mistakes and reckless mistakes. We certainly shouldn't have any mistakes in integrity. I mean, I agree with that. But if you are in a dynamic organization, you are going to change. And if you are going to change, you are going to make mistakes. So I guess we have time for one more question over here. I saw a woman. I got to take it.
You talked about the housing and the education components of this model. Are there also health care and nutrition components?
That is a great question. And in Eastlake, there was not. But in Indianapolis, they're building a health center and a wellness center. In Clarkston, Georgia, they are looking at a health and wellness component. It's fascinating to us who started this. Health and wellness did not come up 15 years ago. But there is so much discussion about it, and I don't know if it's your generation or mine, because I'm a baby boomer. I don't know what's causing it, but healthcare is now coming up. We do not have a project yet that has a healthcare component, but it is definitely on the drawing board to integrate healthcare. The other thing I'll tell you about Indianapolis, which is not true in New Orleans and not true in Atlanta, it's also the first public housing LEED certified in the country. So you see, that goes back to my earlier point. We are evolving, and that's what we intended to do. You've been very generous. Thank you very much.
So on behalf of the Terry College of Business and the Institute of Leadership Advancement, we wanted to give you this photograph of the arches as a token of our appreciation for coming to speak today.
Thank you very much. I'll hang it in my office.
So before you leave, leaders drive positive change. I think Allie had it right. We heard from a legendary leader this morning. You have an information card that was in your seat. If we haven't heard from you, we'd love to get information from you. Thank you to Dean Robert Summacrast and the Dean's Office for their support, Don Edwards, and pulling this event together and arranging for Ms. Franklin to be with us. Thank you to Courtney Aldrich. She works on the ILA staff and really coordinates all the details around this. You picked up the brochure, I hope, as you came in. November 4th, we'll be back in this room. Same time, 10:10 a.m. Tim Chapman, the CEO of Stadium Financial, will be with us. Thank you for being here. Have a great weekend. Go Dogs.